Alright, so I just finished watching the debate between Mook and Sargon and all the others, and I just, well, first of all, I want to congratulate Mook. He did very well, way better than his first debate, but it's a learning curve, it's a process, and he's done a very good job. He's read some books, if you know what I mean, and he's much better for it. So, good job. But the reason I'm making this video is because there's a lot of comments that I wanted to make on things that were said, things that were not said during the debate that need to be said. So let me just begin with that. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about was this idea of why nations fail. That was the name of a book that they're talking about. And what this argument seemed to center around was the rule of law and laissez-faire capitalism, which the rule of law being stronger, the more prosperous a country is, the weaker it is, the weaker the country is, and the idea that laissez-faire capitalism is the most ideal form of capitalism. Academic in particular cited this as the most growth-inducing sort of capitalism. He even went so far to say that when market power gets replaced by political power, it causes cronyism, specifically citing so-called Latin American hellholes as examples of this cronyism. But the interesting thing about this is that, well, when we have market power, it has been its own form of cronyism. We have cases. I worked for a little while in state politics, and there was this thing we used to say that you could buy off a state senator with a sandwich, okay? When you have money, when you have that kind of capital and that kind of accumulation, you can do whatever you want. And there have been studies that have shown, studies after studies, that the opinions of the richest people in this country, and I live in America, that is, are the only ones that count in political decisions. You can literally draw a straight line between what people want and what they hate, and it's just as likely to get passed. It's what's actually popular has no relevance on what gets passed in national legislation, and it's just insane. But somehow, even more insidious than that, when we're talking about market power here, we can also talk about how the market dictates so much of our politics to us. How the politics of minimum wage, of all kinds of reforms, of prices, we can't, so much is already dictated to us by the market. So much of our politics. And people don't realize that how much of our government's decisions are constrained by this, and by especially capital markets. Like, if you do anything that spooks investors, it's never going to happen. But academic wants us to talk about the laissez-faire period of capitalism, so let's talk about that, okay? It's very true. We had a large amount of growth in this period of history, but what he won't tell you is just the sheer amount of violence going on here, and that it wasn't laissez-faire at all. A lot of this was state violence, and when it wasn't state violence, it was still violence. It wasn't a market just going on and doing this by itself. It was gangs in New York City, and when they were talking about gangs here, they were talking about 100 or so people just sitting around waiting to get hired by either the capitalists or the unions to go fight each other, and it was intense. And then we can talk about actual state violence here. We can talk about, for example, the British Army and the Navy crushing Indian cotton industry because it was more efficient and outcompeting British cotton industry. This is like, there was no free market competition here. It wasn't laissez-faire at all. And if we are going to talk about periods of large growth, we should also talk about the medieval period in the Middle East, which had enormous growth. Or the period, there were several, I believe a century or so in China that had also enormous growth in the Middle Ages. And the people don't talk about this because these were market societies. They had markets, but they weren't very capitalist at all. You don't see the kind of corporate entities or ownership kind and accumulation that you see in current capitalist societies. In the case of China, this was mostly due to its state Confucian orthodoxy that really was hostile to profit and the place of the capitalist in enterprise and production. As for the Middle East, well, they had a very odd situation that was probably genuinely laissez-faire, where the state didn't enforce any contracts at all, which meant cutthroat competition, you could actually cut your competition's throat. The only way the system worked was because it relied on people's reputation. And if you just amassed businesses willy-nilly for your own profit, that was kind of bad for your reputation. The bottom line is that in both cases, there were strong countervailing forces that shut down capital accumulation. But perhaps the most interesting part of this whole part of the debate was that academics seem to imply that the reason that this kind of growth from laissez-faire capitalism was no longer repeatable was because of Keynesian reforms and because of all of the changes that had been made by, I'm assuming, the state to impose on the true nature of capitalism. This is at least a little bit hilarious to me anyway, because, in order for a country to develop these days, it needs very strong state intervention. And this isn't a theory that comes from any socialist or anything. It comes from a guy named Alexander Gorshikron, who was very much a capitalist economist, who explained that the more that the whole global economy develops, the more industrialized countries are so far ahead of the non-industrialized world that the more the state needs to intervene to protect its own industries and get them up to speed with subsidies and all kinds of other things so that they can actually compete with the global competition. I mean, just look at China, just look at Japan, just look at South Korea. They all use this basic strategy. Now, that's one part of the debate I wanted to talk about. There is another part that I think might be far more important, and that's the issue of freedom and socialism. The idea that you can't combine freedom with socialism. I don't think that there was enough said on this by the side of the socialists. That they really needed to pick up the game here, because there's so much that bullshit that these guys were just shitting at us. For his part, academic was talking about trade-offs, right? That everything in life was just trade-offs, and that capitalists viewed it that way, that they viewed things incrementally and with trade-offs and that sort of thing, and that socialists viewed things as pure outcomes and that sort of thing. And let me explain to you why this is nonsense. Viewing things as trade-offs isn't some kind of mind-expanding exercise, okay? Viewing things as only trade-offs, and trade-offs are a part of life, it's true. But if that's all you see, you're missing a big part of the picture, that the trade-offs we're being given here in capitalism, trade-off between one brand of deodorant versus another cinnamon-scented brand of deodorant, these aren't real trade-offs. Let me put it this way, is that the choices we're being given, even the ones that are real choices, are preventing us from seeing the fact that we can change the fundamentals here. We have the power to not only choose between a series of choices given to us, we can choose the question. We can choose the options. Let me put it this way. There's a framework that all trade-offs occur in. We can change this framework, and we have the responsibility as a democratic society, or as we should as a democratic society. We're not a democratic society, and that needs to fucking change. But we should have the ability to change this framework. Capitalists like to see everything in society as completely fixed. They don't see it as a result of people actually struggling in their day-to-day lives, people struggling in politics and economics and all that kind of thing, that humans are ultimately responsible for these things, and humans too have the possibility and the power to change them. What we need to do is bring democracy. We need democracy. We need economic democracy. We need political democracy. We need all of it. And we haven't got... Here's a quote that I really love. It's by Rousseau, and here's what he says. He says, "The people of England regards itself as free, but it is grossly mistaken. It is free only during the election of members of parliament. As soon as they are elected, slavery overtakes it, and it is nothing. That's the system we got right now. It's slavery. We don't got power over our society, we don't got power over our politics, we don't got power over our workplace, we don't got power over shit. And that brings me to my next fucking topic. And this one's a doozy, okay? So, what's his name? Oh, that idiot face, the CEO, right? He's talking about how capitalism is the most successful social system in history. And it's socialist. Well, we don't gotta do shit. And the reason why is because capitalism will just, phase out eventually as automation and competition make human labor unnecessary, right? We don't need any revolution. That's a scary word, you understand here. It's just, we don't need any of that. And the craziest part here is that, like, oh no, in Britain there was no violence to get when we got capitalism. I mean, Cromwell, that had nothing to do with anything. It's not like they needed to get rid of the law and political control of feudalism before they could move on to something else. Oh, that had nothing to do with that. Let me tell you why that's some fucking bullshit, okay? Let's just consider, for just a moment, what would begin to happen as we reach the point where automation almost becomes full. It becomes the all-encompassing way products are produced. There are essentially two solutions here. And one of them is, as we've been hearing a lot lately, UBI. You got Universal Basic Income. It basically allows this situation to carry on forever, or until it destroys the planet. Probably not too long. Because it just lets it gives people the income to keep spending, it keeps the consumption going, it keeps the profits moving, assuming that there's not too much competition. And the other alternative, and it's a little bit frightening, is that things begin to regress a bit. And this is because, of course, the people in control of all these machines, of the means of production, they're a very small number of people. And we're strangers to them, you understand that? They don't know us, they probably don't care too much, maybe a little bit in the abstract, but nothing personal, So, they might figure, well, I really like the power that this gives me. It's nice. I get to have sex with all these child prostitutes anytime I want. Why would I give that up? And you begin to see something that resembles an awful lot like slavery or feudalism. Well, probably not feudalism, because or maybe, I don't know. One of the two, where this just gets absolute raw power control over whatever they like, which gets enforced by the state, probably with a robotic police force at this point. So naturally, the second one sounds pretty bad, huh? Well, here's the problem, is that the first one, it's still pretty bad, because it means the inevitable destruction of our planet, of our society, of our civilization, probably even faster. And here's what I mean. Capitalism, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But there's one thing that almost everyone can agree on. Capitalism means growth. It means expansion. Constant expansion. That's profit motive. Keeps it going. We gotta keep making it bigger. Keep making the wealth bigger. Keep producing more and more and more and more. Well, the problem that you begin to run into, and we're just beginning to run into this problem now, although I'm certain that smaller, more isolated societies ran into this in the past, that, well, you're trying to create infinite growth in a finite world, and that's not going to pan out too well for you. And in the meantime, well, here's a nice descriptor of what's going on right now. Now, this is a quote from Deleuze and Guattari? I can't pronounce this guy's fucking name. But it's from Anti-Oedipus, Schizophrenia and Capitalism, right? So here's this great quote. The social machine's limit is not attrition, but rather its misfirings. It can operate only by fits and starts, by grinding and breaking down, in spasms of minor explosions. The dysfunctions are an essential element of its very ability to function, which is not the least important aspect of the system of cruelty. The death of a social machine has never been heralded by a disharmony or a dysfunction. On the contrary, social machines make a habit of feeding on the contradictions they give rise to, on the crises they provoke, on the anxieties they engender, and on the infernal operations they regenerate. Capitalism has learned this, and has ceased doubting itself, while even socialists have abandoned belief in the possibility of capitalism's natural death by attrition. No one has ever died from contradictions, and the more it breaks down, the more it schizophrenicizes, the better it works. The American way. And he wrote this in the 70s, by the way, which I find nuts. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at here is that, much like what Deleuze was getting at, is that capitalism, when it gets into that sense, if it really gets into the UBI rut, it's going to go straight to hell. And what I mean by this is that it's going to hit its external limits. It's going to hit that very edge when the schizophrenia, it can't go anymore. It's already gone past its limits. It's like what should be its social limits. All that's left is the hard material reality of it just crashing and burning as it runs out of resources or triggers ecological catastrophe. The reason I'm talking about this is because I don't think the socialist team addressed this very well. And I know that Mook was talking about how a market crash would force some kind of change to socialism, and that, of course, this would entail some kind of violence. Well, I think that's a remote possibility. I think it's the least likely possibility out of the things I've mentioned. Because when we're talking about a market crash, well, they do happen. But the kind of crash we're talking about here, one distinctly caused by automation and a complete crash of the labor market, well, that's never really been seen before. The labor market in the context of also providing consumption for the general commodity market. The reason I don't think this is very likely to happen is because, well, capitalists have a history of doing things to try to lift up the rate of profit and to keep things going, fighting the law of value itself. Now, normally this wouldn't be a problem if the law of value was always being held in the context of what people like academic call free market competition, because it would just reinforce itself, right? It would, when a company tries to improve its own profits or try to improve its own profitability, it might cut prices, therefore undermining a bunch of other people's profits. Well, capitalists have ways of getting around that historically. I mentioned the Indian example, where the British completely wiped out the local Indian cotton industry because it was more efficient. Well, that's just one example of it. Usually this tends to be across national lines. Well, that's the thing, is that when we hit that point, it may very well be that capitalists try to keep up that rate of profit by just massive wars and that sort of thing. And people, because of the very nature of war and the kind of tensions and emotions it brings up on people, it might very well be enough to mask what's really going on, what really is going on at the heart of capitalism there. So, I do believe, however, that capitalism has come to an end. But more importantly, I also believe that the people that are the capitalists in this debate, and pretty much capitalists most places, do, in their heart of hearts, know that capitalism is also going to end. And I have a very good reason for saying this, because it has a very practical application of this belief. So, we all know about debt, right? We know about national debts. And you hear conservatives complaining a lot that, well, you gotta pay your debts. You gotta make sure that countries are living within their means, that they're not accumulating too much debt, or else they'll never be able to pay it back. Well, the interesting thing about this is that when you think about what debt is, you're really just taking money from the future and spending it today. When this becomes interesting is that, well, if you think capitalism is going to go on forever, and these institutions are going to last as long with it, then it means that, well, the money that you could be spending tomorrow is infinite. That's a strange thought, huh? You could just borrow as much money as you wanted, and there'd always be more to pay it back. Well, it is a very strange idea. And it's a very strange idea that people start to believe in just when they think capitalism will last forever. And there was a moment of that in the 20-aughts, in the 2000s, when the USSR was gone, Marxism was in the dustbin of history, and it didn't look like there was any other alternative to capitalism. And people just started borrowing, and we saw where that ended up now, didn't we? So the bottom line is, everyone knows capitalism's gotta end at some point. And the sooner the better, because we don't know how long until it hits that external limit. And that's what we have to be focused on. We have to be focused on getting worker power, getting real power, not something like UBI, where we're still just the slaves of everyone around us. Now, I know not actual slaves. Slavery was a very specific condition, economic condition, and social condition. But you know what I mean. What we need to have is democracy. Like I said before, we need economic democracy, we need political democracy, we need democracy in the truest sense of the word. And with that comes freedom, comes self-ownership. And the capitalists, they're not going to offer you that. To them, freedom is the freedom to choose what you want at McDonald's. So that's my 2 cents on the matter. And I'm sorry for all of you who had to suffer through this mild-mannered rant. Maybe I'll make more of them in the future. I have a feeling it will only be when I get incredibly frustrated with something, as was the moment today. And I have no editing software or commitments to you, the listener. So basically, I promise nothing, and I will deliver even less. But that's just me. So, but anyway, for your future information, I am Real Enver Hoxa on Twitter, and I'm also Victor Villanueva, the editor of Bunker Mag. I'm trying to bring back Spectre Road. Well, I'm not trying to bring back. I'm trying to make it a new journal that has a more distinct focus and aesthetic, So that's what I'm trying to do, and I'm working with a lot of people to make that happen. But if you're interested in that, go ahead and contact me on Twitter or email me. Yeah, I'll probably have an email in the description, I suppose. But thank you for listening. And good job, Mook. You other guys did okay, I guess. And fuck you, academic. I don't mean to be rude, but fuck you. And the CEO too, especially the CEO and Sargon. Anyway, that's enough.